Welcome back after this short break. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker and internationally recognized expert on the topic of disinformation and democratization, Nina Jankowicz. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your surname. She has written in many major academic newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times or the Washington Post, and is the author of 2 books, How to Lose the Information War, and just published last year by Bloomsbury, How to Be a Woman Online, an examination of online abuse and disinformation and tips for fighting back. Among her many achievements, she has led accessible and actionable research about the effects of disinformation on women. According to the Time magazine, Nina Jankowicz is one of the 100 most influential people in AI. She's currently the vice president at the UK-based Centre for Information Resilience and director of the Hypatia project, which researches and counters online harm targeting women. Interestingly, in 2022, our speaker was appointed to lead the Disinformation Governance Board in US, but she resigned the position after a sustained disinformation campaign that caused the Biden administration to abandon the project. Hence, Jankowicz has extensive experience in disinformation and also in the mass media. In fact, she's a regular guest on radio and television programs from the PBS, CNN, or BBC World Service, among many, many others. And we are delighted to have her with us this afternoon. About the topic of this lecture today, as we all know, unfortunately, and we've just seen on this workshop, online public shaming is increasing. We are all aware of campaigns against women journalists, actresses, politicians, academics, and against non-public figures as well. Sadly enough, as it happens in the analogic world, women are being targeted, like middle-aged women, with the example of Karen's identity, if you are familiar with the Karen Go Crazy shameful videos and the use that they make of them. But yet this happens to women across ages, also to young adults, teenagers, or even children. It's a reflection or a continuum of what we may experience in the real world, but these online platforms enable us to notice how the digital structure helps escalate violence against women and the extent to which it promotes disinformation. To raise our awareness, the expert on this topic, and to find ways to avoid or neutralize its negative effect, our keynote speaker, Nina Jankowicz, will tell us about online gendered abuse and how to fight back. Thanks so much for accepting to take part in this international seminar against gender violence organized by Fundació Isonomia at Universitat Jaume I. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be with you all this evening, and I look forward to sharing some of my experiences with you and having a discussion when the presentation is over. So you've just heard a lot about me and the general work that I do, but I think understanding where I come to this material from, it's important to kind of tell you a little bit of my story. I have a background academically in the Central and Eastern Europe region. I'm actually coming to you from Ukraine right now. And it was in Ukraine that I first was encountering gendered disinformation. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. But I was doing some research here and speaking with women who had been targeted by gendered disinformation. As you've just heard, I've written 2 books, one focused on disinformation as a tool of state warfare, and another one on online abuse. And there's a study that I did at the Wilson Center that I'll talk a little bit about today called Malign Creativity, which looks at how gendered abuse and disinformation has been used against women in the United States as well. I've also done a lot of work in hostile online environments, which I think informs my perspective about online security and the ways that it is connected to protecting yourself from online abuse as well. As you heard, this isn't just a topic that I have written about and done research on. This is also something that's extremely personal for me. And I think it's personal for a lot of women, whether you're an academic, a journalist, or really any woman who expresses a public opinion online. When I was appointed to lead the Disinformation Governance Board in 2022, a lot of conspiracy theories quickly were spread about what the board was going to do. In reality, the board was going to coordinate activities within the federal government at the Department of Homeland Security about disinformation. It had no authority. It certainly wasn't going to be censoring anyone. I was just bringing people together and sharing best practices. But Fox News, along with a number of other publications on both the far right and far left of the political spectrum in the United States, said that this was going to be a ministry of truth. And that lie was bad enough, but the way that I was described was extremely gendered. And my family and I underwent a lot of attacks, threats. We were doxxed, which means that our personal information, my home address, was released to the public. And I'll just read two quotes from a report that was done by an organization called Advanced Democracy, which looked at the conversation around my appointment in the weeks after it was announced. So an article in revolver.news, which is a well-known right-wing disinformation website, described me as blathering and a, quote, woman shrieking. It also linked to a tweet mocking my facial features. Very frequently, women in positions of power are described as looking manly because there's a lot of transphobia that is around women in power as well. And then this other quote says, it depicts some of the violent imagery and threats against me and my family. And I apologize in advance for some of the language that's used here, but I think it's important to talk about. So this was on patriots.win, which is a image board, an anonymous image board where people can post comments as well as images. And this person posted images of tweets about me that came from me, and they wrote, "Here's the ugly cunt Nina Jankowicz, who is heading up the new Ministry of Truth. That has been fact-checked. She is an ugly fucking cunt." And then similarly, they also engaged in transphobic rhetoric. Very soon after all of this was announced, again, my family started receiving threats. At the time, I was a few weeks away from giving birth to my first child, so it was an extremely stressful time to be undergoing such harassment. And unfortunately, the Biden administration not only abandoned the project of the Disinformation Governance Board, but they very much abandoned me as well. They didn't offer me very much in the way of physical security. They did not provide any moral support. They really only did the bare minimum in defending me publicly and pushing back against all of these lies and attacks. And I decided that as I was bringing a child into the world, I perhaps might have been insulated if I left government. And so I left the job after about 11 weeks and gave birth to my son, who is healthy and happy. And I started to work in the civil society sector again, because I felt that I could do more good and make more of an impact outside of government, at least with this administration. And one of the things that I wanted to do is talk to audiences like you about this important topic. So again, thank you for having me here today. What we're going to cover today is, I want to define and understand the problem. I know you've already had a workshop about this, but I think it's important to look at both abuse and disinformation and how they interact. So we'll do that with some case studies based on women in Afghanistan, in Central and Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. I'd love to give you some digital security and IT security considerations. These are easy things that you can do to protect yourself, to make sure that if you're ever in the situation that I've been in, you don't see your private photos or emails or documents leaked to the world. I was very lucky that I had all of this already in place. So while America's public records laws unfortunately made it easy for people to look up my home address, all of the other more private information that I have, even though people were trying to access it, never got out. And in fact, I had a private security consultant who I was working with at the time, who said that if I hadn't been a specialist in this, things could have been much worse. But you don't need to be a specialist to protect yourself. So I'm going to give you those tips today. We'll talk a little bit about trolls and how to endure them. I want to talk about platform policies. So how do you use the terms of service and community standards on platforms like Facebook and Twitter and TikTok in order to make it work for you and preserve the space for you to speak online? I want to talk about community, because that's really one of the most important things in enduring online harassment and preserving your voice. And then finally, I want to leave you with some thoughts about tenacity, how to speak up and fight back. So first, let's define and understand the problem. 336,000. This is a figure that I think is quite staggering from our malign creativity report that the Wilson Center did almost 4 years ago, where we found that number, 336,000, items of gendered or sexualized abuse shared by nearly 200,000 users, directed at just 13 women candidates who were running for office between September and November of 2020. Just 13 women received over 336,000 pieces of abuse. A lot of these were directed at Vice President Kamala Harris, but we had a range of women from both American political parties of different backgrounds, ethnically, racially, age, and everyone received sexualized or gendered abuse. And I doubt that this was all that there was. We had a keyword list that we were searching for these terms for, and people get very creative. That's why the paper is called Malign Creativity. We found that in order to avoid detection by the social media platforms, users were coming up with ways, creative ways, to abuse their targets without being found out. So one example of that is writing the word bitch, but instead of using the letter I, people would use an exclamation point. But obviously the effect on the user who is receiving that message is still the same. And they used many, many worse and more disgusting things as well. As I mentioned before, I came at this from the very first time I encountered it from here in Ukraine. I was doing early research for my book in Ukraine and also in the Republic of Georgia. And I met a woman who was a member of parliament. She had been an activist and a journalist before she was elected after Euromaidan in 2014. And she told me a story about how she had been smeared in a sexualized campaign that superimposed her face on a naked woman's body. And it was poorly done. It was clearly fake. But these images of her were spread all around the internet. They were spread primarily in Russian-speaking forums. And because she was a kind of pro-democracy activist in Ukraine, she was heavily suspicious that these came from Russia. I came across another example of similar sexualized disinformation when I was in Georgia, and a journalist there was implicated in a sex tape. The sex tape claimed that she had cheated on her husband, who was a prominent Georgian opposition politician. And she was able to disprove this. Not all the other women who were targeted were so lucky. She was able to disprove this because she has a large tattoo on her back. And the woman that was allegedly her in the video did not have that tattoo. And so I started looking into the ways that foreign actors like Russia use inherent misogyny in our societies to silence women, to make our democracies less equitable and less representative. And we did a number of research projects looking at this. I've found so many women who have been targeted by this from campaigns, again, that they suspect were from foreign entities. But as I noted before, this is also something domestic actors use, both on a more organized level through political parties, but also on an individual level, because it's unfortunately considered acceptable in society to abuse women, especially online. There are very few consequences for it. The platforms are reticent to do anything about it. And it's just seen as part of the job when you are a woman in public life. And so I have set out since then to really push back against that. I do not think it should be the cost of doing business to speak your voice as a woman and then receive this vile abuse that our male colleagues, they might receive abuse, but it is not sexualized. It is not rape threats. It is not, about their suitability for bearing children, things like that. My organization, the Center for Information Resilience, has also done a number of research papers about how gendered abuse is used in Afghanistan. We actually have another paper coming out next Tuesday. We're having an event. If you're interested in attending, you can look for Afghan Witness, and you'll find ways to register online. But this is from our earlier research paper, which showed an immediate and consistent increase in gendered hate speech directed toward Afghan women's rights activists after the Taliban took over Afghanistan. So not only did we see a crackdown on women's rights in real life, we saw a shrinking of the online space for women in Afghanistan as well. There were spikes in hate speech directed at women that corresponded with activism, offline activism that women were undertaking. There were targeted disinformation campaigns that were designed to discredit women, again, usually dealing with things about their sexuality, their alleged promiscuity, etc. And again, combined with the offline violence that women are experiencing in Afghanistan, this has overall a silencing effect on women's participation. So now that you have seen a couple of examples, here's the way that I define these two topics. I see this as an inverted pyramid with gendered abuse at the top. So gendered abuse is kind of all-encompassing of the broader gendered, or the smaller gendered and sexualized disinformation threat. Gendered abuse is the often casual use of derogatory terms aimed at degrading or insulting women based on their gender, and this can range from name-calling to sexually violent threats. The subset of that, gendered and sexualized disinformation, uses false or misleading narratives that are gendered and sex-based, often with some degree of coordination, aimed at deterring women from participating in the public sphere. So those are three things that I think are important. This isn't just lies, it is false or misleading gender and sex-based narratives, so falsity, coordination. Very often these narratives are coordinated, and I certainly experienced that with my own recent battles as well. And they are aimed to silence us. The point is to say, you are not welcome here. This is what you get for voicing your opinion as a woman. And if you can't take it, you should leave. And I want you to keep that in mind as we think about holding the space for public participation of women and how we can do that in the future. Gendered abuse is also compounded for those with intersectional identities. So if you're a Black woman, the abuse is much worse. If you're a gay woman, the abuse is much worse. If you're a Black gay woman, the abuse is probably 3 or 4 times as worse. And we have found this consistently through focus groups, but also through the quantitative studies that we have done, not only in Afghanistan, We've also done some in Myanmar, and certainly our study in 2020, again, which had different ethnicities represented. We also found, and I've alluded to this before, that most gendered and sexualized disinformation narratives either had an element of sex in them, or they were racist, or they were transphobic. So this is why we see some of this compounded abuse. This is an important quote, again, about preserving that public space and the effect of this abuse. Often we see statistics, right, about women's online abuse, and it doesn't mean as much until you talk to somebody who's been affected by this. So in one focus group we conducted, a woman who is really regarded as a leader in her field, someone who has decades of experience, but has gone through some online abuse herself, and she's also a disabled woman, so she's part of one of those intersectional identities that receives online abuse at a higher rate. She said, "You don't feel safe to continue speaking, so you don't speak." She talked about how she often locks or shuts down her profiles during increased episodes of abuse because it's just too tiring and exhausting for her. And she's worried about the overall effect on her mental health, on the security of her family, and she feels like it's just not worth it. And so she closes herself off to opportunities when otherwise her male colleagues might be able to be open to them. One incident that she described was also about a time when she gave congressional testimony, and she got some online abuse beforehand that was quite violent and virulent. And she knew that this was coming from the message board 4chan, and she decided she didn't want to deal with that. So she locked her profile during that congressional testimony, which is when often people in the academic sphere or research sphere will get a lot of questions and requests for comment or requests to write articles from media outlets. So again, closing herself off just to make sure that she didn't have to deal with the abuse. So why should we care about this? This isn't just a women's issue. This is a democratic issue. This is something that affects the very fabric of our democracies. It affects the democratic process and public life. We need legislatures and platforms to stand up for us, and we need to stand up for ourselves as well, because we can't have a democracy that doesn't have the full and equal participation of a large part of society. So let's talk about digital security and the things that I hope you'll go home tonight and do. This is a little bit technical. I hope these are things that you've heard of before. And if not, I have shared the slides with the conference organizers, which include a bunch of resources that can walk you through how to do this. I also encourage you, of course, to buy my book, which goes through all of this in detail, but I'll go through it kind of quickly today. The most important thing that you can do to protect your personal information, your emails, important documents, etc., is to have two-factor or multi-factor authentication enabled. Essentially, what this does is your first factor of authentication, where you're signing into your account and it knows it's you, is your password. You want to put a second layer of security on that, a physical or digital security key. This is a USB stick. The company YubiKey is quite popular, but you can also use your phone. There are apps that will generate codes for you so that when you're logging into your account, particularly if you're logging in from somewhere that you don't normally log into, you need that second factor of authentication to get into your account. This means that if somebody found out your password, they would not be able to get in. This is so important. If you remember what happened to the Democratic National Committee in 2016, it was partially because they weren't using multi-factor authentication that they were able to be hacked by the Russian government. I also encourage you to use a password manager. This can be a little bit of a pain to set up, because I know a lot of us still like to use pad and pencil for writing down our passwords and keeping it in a notebook or just trying to remember all of them. but our brains cannot remember the type of complex, long passwords that have numbers, letters, and special characters that we need to make our accounts most secure. So I encourage you to use a service like 1Password, which will do all of that for you. It is a lifesaver. You can use it as a browser plugin, and essentially all I have to do when I use it is use my fingerprint or face recognition, and it will use all of the passwords to automatically input them. It will also generate new passwords for you when you're signing into a new website, so you don't have to think of them anymore. These are two things that I like to say are set it and forget it. And once you have this set up, it will really make your life easier and so much more secure. And these are two of the things that my security consultant, who was helping me when I was enduring my harassment, said that were really important for keeping me safe. If you're doing a lot of traveling or perhaps research in potentially hostile environments, I encourage you to look at using a VPN. This can mask your web traffic. So for instance, if I were to travel to Russia today, I would use a VPN on all of my communications. It doesn't mean that someone can't intercept what you are writing, but at least it will mask what websites you are accessing while you're there. I also encourage you to use encrypted communications. So whether that is WhatsApp or Signal, really important if you want to keep what you're saying safe. iMessage is also encrypted if you're using an iPhone to an iPhone, but it gets quite complicated if you're not sending it to an iPhone user. So I encourage you to think about using WhatsApp and Signal. I know it's much more popular in Europe. Telegram and Facebook Messenger have options that they're encrypted, but you have to turn that on manually. So if you use those consistently, I encourage you to check that box and make sure you're using encrypted communications. Finally, this is an important note about these messengers. It's not going to do you very much good if you're backing up all of your chats to the cloud, and then the cloud, whether you use Android or whether you use Apple phones, someone accesses your iCloud or whatever service you use to back up your phone. Make sure your cloud backup is turned off, or else you're just introducing another vulnerability that someone can access. And we've seen a lot of celebrities have their photos and messages accessed this way through iCloud. I would also encourage you to not take the easy way out when you're creating new logins for websites. Very frequently, when we're logging into websites, we're prompted to use our Google account or a Facebook account. There's two things wrong with this. The first and most important one is that if you use one of those accounts and it gets compromised, then every single one of the websites that you are using that is connected to that account will also be compromised. So it's better to split them up. And again, this is much easier to do when you are using a password manager. The second issue with this is just your data privacy. When you are logging into another web service using Google or Facebook, you are also giving those companies your data. So if you don't feel badly about that, that's up to you. I encourage you to separate them and just make sure that you are kind of taking as much control of your data as you can. A few niche considerations about how we share online. And it's been a long time since I've done this presentation, and this is my dog, Jake. Jake unfortunately passed away in August, so it's good to see his smiling face. So I used to share a lot of pictures of Jake online, and one of the things that I had to become very aware of was the fact that his dog tags would be on in pictures. So a lot of people will blur them out. What I used to do is we flipped his tag around so that it was facing inside on his collar. That way no one could zoom in and see our address and phone number. I'm not sure if that's common practice in Spain, but something to consider. I also work for an organization that really specializes in online investigations and geolocation. And my colleagues love to freak me out by, if I share, something from my neighborhood, they're able to geolocate me down to the square meter. So if you are concerned about your physical safety, be really careful about sharing photos of your residence or neighborhood online. I even, worry about sharing sometimes pictures from hotels that I'm staying in, because they can be located fairly easily, looking at kind of pattern recognition on wallpaper or carpet. It's also important to use caution when sharing mundane details about your life. These can be used to replicate your patterns of life if someone is looking at kind of threatening you in person, but also it can be used to access your account. So the security questions that we all use, things like what color is your car, what is your favorite restaurant? All of these can be used to gain access to your account. When you're traveling, a couple of things, especially in hostile environments: power down your devices and turn off facial and fingerprint recognition if you're crossing borders into countries that are hostile. I put this picture of me on the side because this is an example of a picture I would not ever post in real time, especially with the considerations I have in the United States more so than in Europe. I would wait at least until I was back at the location that I was staying at, if not several days, before I post this picture publicly. And also, I just encourage you to establish regular check-ins with your friends, family, and colleagues. I know it seems like a huge bummer to think about all of these things, but there are some really smart people online who can take the smallest details of your life and use it to really target you. So please do think about it. So let's talk about trolls. This is the fun part. What do trolls want when they're attacking you online? The first thing is that they benefit from your engagement with them, particularly researchers and academics who are seen as trusted voices online. If somebody with just a couple of followers is interacting with you and you are a trusted, tenured academic at a well-known university, they are getting clout from interacting with you. So remember that. They also want to silence you. They are trying to embarrass you and force you out of public life. Don't let them do that. And then finally, they might be trying to elicit your personal information, again, so that they can target you like we've just talked about. I'll talk about some strategies for dealing with them in just a second. I just wanted to share, this is a network graph of what some of the abuse against Kamala Harris looked like. I think this is useful because it shows what it feels like to be at the center of dogpiling, where everyone is coming at you at once. It's really like being in a swarm of insects. And as you can see, the racist and sexualized terms, I hope you can see it on your screen, are green and blue. And there are quite a few nodes of this graph that are using that sort of language. This doesn't include gendered terms. All the black ones are gendered, basically. They're not colored. But I think this is an important way of understanding how trolls work. They are trying to swarm you and silence you. I'm going to skip this for today because I think a lot of the humor, unfortunately, won't translate. But I encourage you to pick up my book if you want to learn about some of the types of trolls that I deal with and why I think they're absolutely ridiculous. But making fun of trolls and using humor is something that gives me great satisfaction. And I encourage you to use it, even though it can be really awful to deal with trolls, using humor to kind of put them in their place and also expose the craziness of the situation has been something that's really helped me through it. So in addition to using humor, what else can we do? First, this is a problem that you have to manage. You're not going to solve it. It's fairly endemic to the misogynistic kind of culture of the internet. The most economical response that you can use is to mute and move on. This means that you can just turn off everything that you see from this person. You never have to look at them again unless you choose to, and they are going to be shouting into the void forever and always. And I find that quite satisfying. Then I think there's also something important to be said about using your account for good. So this is a quote from my friend Vanessa Badham, who is an Australian playwright and writer. And she said, don't bomb the village. And that's why I have a picture of Daenerys Targaryen from Game of Thrones here. my friend Vanessa said, there's a psychological payoff to swatting a fly, but to the outside, it looks like you're bombing a village. So what does that mean in the context that we're using it in? If you're a big account with a lot of clout, or even if you're just a mid-sized account, and you are quote unquote dunking, making fun of somebody who is abusing you, it can look optically, not very good for you. So I suggest you be the bigger person. And here's how I do that. I block people. I really used to think that, especially on Twitter, I wanted it to be democratic. I wanted to engage in discussion with people. That all stopped when I was enduring the worst of my harassment. I blocked over 650,000 people for the things that they were saying about me that were not true and that were quite violent. And I encourage you to do the same. But also when you're engaging with these folks, or if you do want to draw attention to what they're doing, deny them influence, deny them notoriety. How do we do that? Don't reply to them more than once. If it seems like they're engaging in bad faith, just leave it. Don't quote tweet them. What you can do is use screenshots. So it might be hard to see here, but what I do is I take a screenshot of the tweet or the piece of content that is in question, and I remove any evidence of that person's handle, their profile picture, anything like that. Because one, I want to deny them that influence and notoriety, but I also don't want my followers to go and abuse them further. I don't want to be involved in that cycle of abuse. So this is the way I do it. Everyone has their own approach. It's inherently very personal, but I find this extremely satisfying because I'm educating my followers about the types of things that I get on a daily basis, but I'm doing it in a way that doesn't perpetuate the abuse or boost the trolls. 2 quick points about email abuse. Hopefully you don't have this at your universities. You've got your separate work account and your personal account. But if you find yourself in a time in your life when you're consulting or doing freelance, or if you're a journalist, I really encourage you to separate your work and personal accounts, because once that personal email address gets out there, you will receive a lot of threats and abuse on that email address. I didn't do that, and it's something that I wish I did. Importantly, recently on Gmail, they have introduced a way to report abusive account holders. You used to not be able to do this. So there's a link, I believe, in the resources section of this presentation that will tell you all about that. If you're experiencing email abuse and you use Gmail, I encourage you to look it up. Most importantly, if you walk away with one thing today, your social media profiles are not a democracy. You are not obligated to listen to a bunch of abuse from people. They are a kingdom for you, right? You are the king or queen of those profiles, and you should mute, you should block, you should remove followers as you see fit to make sure that you have space to continue speaking out. So platforms. This section, unfortunately, has changed a lot very recently because of the changes that Elon Musk has instituted at Twitter, which used to be kind of the place that so many people were, experiencing the internet. But all of this being said, I think it's important to use the tools that platforms provide to your advantage. What do I mean by that? It might seem useless to report content to the platforms if they're not going to take action on it. And I have found by and large that they do not. However, it gives really important signals to the platforms, not only when you report people, but when you're muting and blocking people. Essentially, this says to the platforms, this person is problematic. 200 people have blocked them today. They keep sending abusive content. We've got 400 reports about things that they've said today. Perhaps we need to take action against this account. And I encourage you to read the terms of service or the community standards on platforms that you use so that you know when you see violative content. This is something that Twitter used to have called safety mode. They've since, I think, removed it. But again, take advantage of the features that exist. Instagram has similar things where you can block keywords. So does, I believe, TikTok if you use it. You can turn off replies and comments. You can hide or delete responses. All of these things are critical to maintaining a space for you to express yourself and your opinions. You don't need to feel badly about it. If you are undergoing really difficult abuse, I encourage you to think about how you'll preserve evidence for both for social media platforms as well as law enforcement. We can talk about this in the Q&A if there's interest, but you can just take screenshots generally. That works. It's something that I've used in cases that I've brought against online stalkers that I have. But there are more advanced ways to do this if you're really experiencing high volume of abuse. And again, this will be available in the packet that is given to you after the seminar. As I said, community. This is one of the last things I'll talk about today. It is so important to build a support network. This isn't something that happens automatically. I think a lot of us believe that when online abuse happens to us, it's going to be very easy for us to find support among our family and friends and among our colleagues. And my experience, and that of many other women, is that often, particularly the men in our lives, don't really understand what it's like to be undergoing this specific sort of gendered and sexualized abuse. But even more broadly than that, unless you have undergone online abuse, a lot of people don't understand it. For example, my husband and mother, although I love them very much, and they both read my book multiple times as it was being, written and edited, when I was undergoing the worst of my abuse, both of them said things to me like, just don't read the comments, which, wasn't useful because we were being threatened at that time and I needed to take action and I needed support from it. So from them rather. So you need to explain to your family and friends what it is you need. Sometimes it might be that you don't want to talk about it. Sometimes it might be that you just want to rant, but being explicit with them is really important. Also, build a community of like-minded people around you. Some of the people that I lean on during these difficult times are women who they're also writers. They write many different things, but they've all undergone online abuse. And this is something that we help each other through. And that community, not necessarily disinformation researchers or people who have worked in government policy, it was that community of writers that was really helpful to me. So seek out those like-minded people. And then finally, engage in online practices that make the internet safer for everybody, especially women. So what do I mean by that? If you see online abuse, you should do something about it. You should report it. You should maybe send that person a message of support that's being abused. You should engage with other people who are often silenced on platforms like Facebook or Twitter, people who undergo more abuse than others. For example, when I'm retweeting something about the war in Ukraine, I try to find a female correspondent who is writing about this and tweeting about, current events. I'm using Twitter as an example. Unfortunately, I'm not very much on Twitter anymore, given what's happened to it, but you get the idea. I try to create the internet as I wish to see it, and that is so important. Another thing that I think is important, particularly in the academic space where you are all expected to be engaging with the public, is to pressure your employers to support you if you're going to be undergoing online abuse. This is actually something that I've just launched a new policy at the Center for Information Resilience about, because we're all quite public with our work. We've got a lot of investigators who do this stuff, and I thought it was important that we protected our employees. So this will include things like support for anti-doxing software, removing private information from the internet, knowing that if you are doxed, that your employer will bring you to a safe space, whether that is a hotel or a second apartment or something for you and your family until the threat has passed, that they might provide you with legal support if you're going to be bringing any suits against the people who have harassed you. So important, and I encourage you to talk up to your employers about it. And then finally, last but not least, go to therapy. I know in many cultures, therapy is still considered something that is silly. I can't tell you how important it was for me to have somebody who could help me through some of the very difficult and traumatic experiences that I have gone through as a result of the abuse I've experienced. So why are we doing all of this? How do we find that tenacity to hold space for our online engagement? The thing that keeps me going when I get really exhausted is that it's not just about me. Yes, I would love, for everyone to recognize what it is that I've gone through, but it's really about the women who come after me. It is about the women that I mentor at work. It is about the women who I do, informational interviews with, who are just thinking about going to college or going to grad school or asking how they can get involved with the field that I'm in. The internet is critical for discussion, for politics, activism, and expression. And until everybody has an equal voice there, we're not truly going to be equal anywhere. So think about those future scholars, academics, writers, all of those people whose voices have historically been marginalized, and make sure we hold our ground for them. That's why I continue to speak out. I speak out about not only my experiences online, but my research, because I want to show everyone who thinks that they, had semi-succeeded in silencing me, that I'm still here. And that's what keeps me going.